Welcome to the final Ask an Elder episode of 2020. This week, we will feature a conversation with President Aaron Walton from Cheyney University. Given the heightened visibility of HBCUs this year as a result of the election cycle and its key players, we thought we would return to the beginning of this chapter of our history and feature a focus on our nation's first HBCU, Cheyney University.
Hello and welcome to X and Elder. My name is Najiba Beha and I am a 2018 Cheyney University graduate. During my time at Cheyney University, I was actively engaged on campus and also a member of the Keystone Honors Academy. I'm currently completing my third year at the Penn State Dickinson Law School. As a proud alum of the nation's first HBCU, I am honored to have this opportunity to talk with President Aaron Walton, Cheyney's current president. President Aaron A. Walton was a leader in the education and corporate level management for over 40 years. He was appointed as Cheyney University of Pennsylvania's interim president on May 31st, 2017. Due to his exceptional performance and impeccable experience, he was quickly promoted as the permanent president of Cheyney University. Over the years, Dr. Walton accomplished many extraordinary things, such as establishing a healthcare initiative to address childhood obesity, helping develop the Children's Health Insurance Program, also known as CHIP, holding leadership and advisory roles on over 35 community boards, and many, many more accomplishments. Please join me in welcoming President Aaron A. Walton. Good morning, President Walton.
Good morning, Sheba. It is so nice to see a Cheyney grad.
Likewise. So, before we get into some specific education world questions, I just want you to tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, where did you grow up? How did you get into this intriguing world of speech pathology and audiology that I've been hearing about? Just starting with some of the basics.
Okay, I'm a country boy. I was born in a place called Maxwell, Pennsylvania, which actually does not exist today. It was a little coal mining town.
Mm-hmm.
My father was a coal miner and a minister, and my mother was a homemaker. I'm the last of 12 children.
Oh, wow.
We had quite a crew. What I'll say is my early years were formed by the family dynamics, because my dad being a minister, my mother being a homemaker, both of them from the South, migrated to the North, where we're very strict disciplinarians. So I grew up in a house that was, one, full of love, but secondly, full of discipline. So there was a family structure that I have always been fortunate to be part of. And we grew up, everyone in our community was poor, but it didn't really matter because everyone was the same. And poor did not define who you were. It just happened to be a status that you happen to have. So I've always been one to aspire the fact, or to encourage the fact that your current circumstance does not dictate what your future holds for you. So I could have never, whenever I was back 5, 6 years old and living in that environment, imagine where I would be today,
Right.
So I went to an integrated grade school and high school. Actually started working for a grocery store when I was 8 years old. So I have been gainfully employed since I was 8 years old, and started paying into Social Security when I was 12. So I was fortunate that all through high school and college, I was able to earn money and to help put myself through school. So I wasn't necessarily a burden on my parents, because I was fortunate to have a job. And that actually encouraged me to go on. I had 3 or 4 siblings that had already gone to college before I went. So there was not a question of if I was going, it was just a question of where I was going.
Right.
California University of PA, which was a state teachers college at that time, was only about 4 miles from my home. So that made it very, very easy for me to make that decision. I was going to where I could get to on a daily basis without a lot of issue, because I still had a job that I maintained all through college. Those are my early years. In terms of speech pathology, I inadvertently got into speech pathology. I thought that it was oratorical speech when I went for orientation. And I thought, oh, that would be great because of my exposure to working in a store. I wanted to be a business person.
Mm-hmm.
It would be very, very important for me to be able to make presentations. So I'll take this curriculum. Well, little did I know or find out soon after I took my phonetics course and a couple other courses, I said, this is not oratorical speech, this is speech correction. And I was intrigued by it.
Right.
I was intrigued by it. I said, you know what? I'm going to stick with this because I don't believe in coincidence. I believe that our lives are divinely ordered.
Mm-hmm.
And that wherever we find ourselves, and this is scripture, we should be satisfied.
Mm-hmm.
So I found myself matriculating in a curriculum that I really hadn't designed for me, but it actually ended up being to my advantage.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to work with stroke patients as part of my practicum, speech correction with a lot of kids after and during student teaching, et cetera. And actually, my first job out of college was a speech therapist for the Pittsburgh City Schools. I was the first African-American speech therapist at Pittsburgh Public Schools
Right.
in the late 60s. So it led me to a profession that I had not intended to be in. And it's the low level of the medical profession because you do work with patients. And while I was there, I was introduced to the Pittsburgh diocese, and I actually did speech therapy for the diocese at night. And the director of a tutoring center came open, and I took that job the next year because it
Mm-hmm.
exposure to a lot more students, and it gave me exposure to people who still needed speech correction.
Right.
It was while I was there that we went through the riots of the 60s and part of the movement.
Oh, wow.
And affirmative action. And I was given an opportunity to take a management trainee job at Blue Cross of Western Pennsylvania. And it was, I really didn't want the job. I wanted to continue to stay where I was. But when we began to have the discussions with the management about the future of healthcare and where it was going, and I could see that everyone gets sick and eventually and needs health care. So it kind of moved me into that healthcare arena. I took the job as a trainee.
Right.
And ended up staying there 40 years in various capacities, starting with a management trainee and ending up when I left as one of the 9 principal officers of the corporation reporting to the president.
Right.
Your beginning
Amazing.
don't tell you where you're going to end up. And I had no idea that that's where it would have taken me. But fortunately, I had 14 different assignments over those 40 years, was able to be instrumental in a number of initiatives that were cutting edge. And part of my role was turning around some of our subsidiary corporations that were fledgling, and I was to nurse them back to health. So that experience, being on 35 different boards, many of which were troubled, working in the church for my entire career as an officer and deacon in the church. And, being a part of the church, you learn an awful lot about human nature and people and situations. Also being chair of a number of African-American organizations as well as majority organizations gave me a lot of experience in terms of dealing with people and seeing a lot of situations. So by the time I came to Cheney in 2017, I likened that into the journey that Moses had. Moses' job was to lead the children of Israel out of bondage. It took 80 years for God to prepare Moses for his assignment. When I came to Cheney, I was 70. I said, it took 70 years for God to prepare me for this assignment, but I felt that I'd had experiences in enough arenas that the challenges that I found when I came to Cheney, I had experienced all those challenges somewhere in my career.
Right.
Not come into Cheney without a knowledge of how I had handled situations that were similar to the ones that I found at Cheney.
Right.
That got me here with a lot of stops along the way, and one of which was the Pennsylvania. Uh, um, I was on the PASHE Board of Governors for 14 years before I came to Cheney, and I happened to have been a trustee at my own alma mater, California, and chairman of their trustee council. So I'm fortunate. I've had all the roles in the state system. I was a student. I was a trustee at my university.
Building way up.
And now the president of one of the state universities. So I've got perspectives that I would not normally have had I not had the exposure to all those different places.
Right. You know, it's interesting that you say that, because sometimes they say in order to even lead a company, you have to start as a worker of a company to really do well, just in the field in general. So it's interesting that you say that.
That's a very accurate statement, because in the trainee program that I entered when I first went to Blue Cross,
Mm-hmm.
it was a cross-divisional training program. So they trained you in marketing, they trained you in customer service, a bit in finance, et cetera, because the order for rotation is how we were brought in as a trainees. The next opening in any of the divisions you would be assigned to. So
Right.
they give you a smattering of all of them, and whenever an opening would occur, you had to go into that opening. It wasn't a negotiable. It was designed for you to go into it.
Right. Okay, so just
I'm going to stop right there, because even though it was designed to go into it, in my case, it didn't happen. I was probably the first African American trainee, and there were some Caucasian trainees who were brought in after me, and we were supposed to be according to chronology in which we came into the corporation. I was not. When the first opening came about, another individual who had come in after me got that opening.
oh wow.
And I filed a equal opportunity employment charge against the company. The bold move back then,
Right.
was I was married and had a child, but my dad did not teach me to move away and run away from any situation where I felt injustice was being done.
Yep.
And that situation cleared itself up very, very quickly. And I was put into a role.
So they ended up giving you your role.
Not that one. They ended up giving me one very shortly thereafter. But I wanted to prove that I was not going to be afraid to speak up for the proposition that had been presented to me. Wasn't I made the rules. The rules were there. I was trying to follow them. So in this era of diversity, equity, inclusion, I was a product of it to begin with. So in today's world, it's extremely important to me, because I thought there was a lot of unfinished business back in the affirmative action time of the late 60s that got out after a few years. And now it seems to have resurged again. And what we can't afford to do is let it die out again. It's got to be.
Right. So just piggybacking on what you said about the health care industry, what would you say some of your key accomplishments or programs that you've established that you're most proud of?
That's a good question. The one that I probably am most proud of is during my tenure, after I've been there a number of years, the board actually created a foundation. And they asked me to have organizational responsibility for the foundation, and they put $100 million in the foundation.
Oh, wow.
And that was unheard of.
Right.
And it was at that time that obesity and a lot of issues were beginning to occur, that we began to pay attention to them. And one of our focus was on children, because we had started the Children's Health Insurance Program, or the CHIP program. And I was instrumental in moving that program along, which it actually became a national model. But in working with the foundation and the money that we were given, it gave us an opportunity to focus on the psychosocial issues that impact children, obesity, mental health, etc. And I was able to establish a 5-pronged approach to dealing with the issues that have to do with children. And we were one of the first corporations that attacked the obesity problem back in the late 80s, early 90s.
Right.
That program in some form exists today, some 25 years later. So we were the first to kind of engage and get into that process, and a lot of others followed us, but we were first. So
But we were first.
I love being first.
And now look where you are, the first HBCU.
I'm at first. Could have never anticipated that I would be at the first HBCU because I was not a product of an HBCU.
Right.
I was
Exactly.
a predominantly institution.
But you were used to setting your own path.
There you go.
So, and that's what it took to be at a first HBCU. So, you're telling me a lot about the healthcare industry and where you're from, your roles and accomplishments. So, how exactly did this translate into you becoming interested in getting into the education field?
Okay, first of all, I was not interested in getting into the education.
Oh, wow. Okay.
if the truth be known, back in 2017, being on the board of governors, and I was actually I had been the chair of academic affairs for the system, and was chairing health HR for the system at that time at the board level. We found ourselves in a position where we were going to be without a president at Cheney, and this was May. We needed someone to be in the role for June 1st because Cheney in a show cause status with the Middle States Accreditation Commission as to why it should continue to be accredited. And one of the issues was consistent leadership. A number of years, Cheney had 4 either interim or presidents
we did.
In a span of 10 years.
Yes, we did.
That's too much mobility in terms of leadership where you can't stabilize an organization. So the board chair and along with the executive group asked if I would step off of the board. So I had to resign from the Board of Governors and from California University. And if I would come to Cheney as an interim for 6 months to a year, or actually for 6 months, until we would begin to search for a permanent president. And that was, I came here on June 5th of 2017. I will never forget that day.
Yeah, you were here my last year.
That's exactly right. So I had no idea what I was stepping into until I got here, because you can hear a lot about an organization from the outside. And I had, because I was on the board for 12, 14 years, heard a lot about Cheney, but it's like you shutting the door in your own home. Shut the door, no one knows what's going on in your house except you. Came to Cheney, I found out more than I would have ever known because I had never been a part of the culture of Cheney. I learned a lot very, very quickly, and I didn't want to waste that 6 months because there was much work to be done at Cheney. At least I can start a process and then we'll pass it off to someone that can complete the process. And how I was somewhat familiar is in the early part of 2017, the board had appointed what we call the Cheney Task Force.
Okay, I've heard about that.
The Cheney Task Force was comprised of board members. It was comprised of a person or two from the university, some legislators, some outside professionals. And our job was to reimagine what Cheney could be. Based on some of the data that we had looked at in terms of issues that existed at Cheney and that didn't exist in other places that we could perhaps adopt. So we actually came with a 10-point plan on how we would transform Cheney. That was in February and March of 2017. The board approved the plan. It would be sent to Cheney the last week of May of 2017. Guess who arrives at Cheney and gets asked to come to Cheney the last week of May? Me. project we'd worked on for several months about Cheney, I'm sent to Cheney to implement something we've been talking about for 2 or 3 months. So
Right.
I at least had a blueprint of where we might start because a lot of good energy had gone into establishing the Cheney Task Force report.
Right.
So doing a quick situational analysis that began actually the day I came in, we looked at academics, finance, people, processes, services, infrastructure, culture, everything very, very quickly. Because you're going to determine what you have to do, you have to have a baseline. And the baseline was looking at all these areas and finding out how much work had to be done and each
Right.
area to begin to move the organization forward. I was fortunate in one respect. I didn't know anyone at Cheney.
Oh, wow.
So that actually ended up being a blessing in disguise. Uh,
Right.
and when I met with the trustees, it enabled me to have a very, very frank and open conversation with them about the fact that in corporate, I had had the assignment of nursing organizations that were failing back to good health.
Mm-hmm.
It is not always a pleasant experience because there are some negative things that you have to do when you're trying to save an organization.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically said, I am not in charge of happiness. I'm in charge of change.
Right.
Some changes that will occur that will be distasteful to a lot of people because there's a lot of work to be done. But I'm okay with that
Right.
because
Right.
you have to do what you've got to do when you recognize that change needs to be made. So I
Mm-hmm.
had their support in doing whatever I needed to do to move Cheney back in the direction that it needed to move in. So recently, not knowing anyone at Cheney and having had contacts with individuals in other professions throughout the United States, I asked the gentleman who was president of Bryant College in New England who had retired. He knew the academic piece. I asked a person who had been a professor and a physician at Boston University. He came and he helped me. I had a writer that had been a writer for Blue Cross whenever I was there. These were all retirees. And
Right.
I had a gentleman that came from the West Coast who was the owner of an international consulting firm on organizational change and transformation. And I was acquainted with him through another friend. And all these individuals I brought to Cheney to help for that 4 to 6 month period that I thought I would be there.
Right.
That was in August. And in September, we had a report due to Middle States on where we were with our accreditation process.
Mm-hmm.
Shared that report based on the work that this team had done with Middle States. And the examiners from Middle States saw tremendous potential in the plan that we put together.
Right.
A lot of it had to do with the Cheney Task Force report. We just began to implement what had been discussed.
Oh, the foundation.
That's correct, as a foundation.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Middle States team came in and they met with us, they were very, very surprised, shocked, and
Mm-hmm.
the plan that we had laid out. And they actually had a discussion with the trustees. And I think they discussed with the trustees if they liked the direction that the team I brought in was taking. And if they couldn't convince me to stay for at least 4 years, then there was a likelihood that the university was not going to receive its accreditation.
Oh, wow.
At that time, that the trustees had a conversation with me and had a conversation with the Board of Governors. We had already started the search.
Right.
They at that point, they decided to suspend the search. And there's a procedural process that you actually have to go through in order to become a candidate for presidency. And that's being interviewed by the students, the faculty, the board, constituents, et cetera. I went through all those processes in terms of being interviewed by all those constituencies to satisfy the legal requirement. And the board voted to make me a permanent president on November 13th of 2017,
Mm-hmm.
6 days in advance of the appearance that I had to make before the Middle States Commission.
Right. Well,
I, along with the team, went in to make the presentation to Middle States on the 19th of November. I could go in saying I was the permanent president of Cheney.
right.
Really had some impact because one of the issues had been not having a permanent president.
Right.
So that started it. I knew then that I had committed to 4 years, and I knew that there was a lot of work to be done in that period of time. So a number of the individuals who had given me their 4 months, they went back to their life's work, and I had 2 individuals who kind of stuck with me through the first year, and then one has been with me since the beginning, and he is
Right.
committed to 4 months, and he's now been with me for 3.5 years. And it said, as long as I'm here, he's here.
Right. So, what helped you decide which individuals you thought would be best to help you get Cheney back on track?
That's a good question. Having done the quick assessment, I knew I needed to have someone that had a strong financial background. So
Yeah.
that I brought in from California had been the CFO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, and
Oh, good.
Gems for GE, had been all over the world and in different assignments. So he had a very strong financial background. From an academic perspective, having come out of academia, I leaned on a friend who was the president of a college in New England. And
Mm-hmm.
he had gone through accreditation processes at New England. So I asked him if he would help me. The physician that I recruited from Boston University, his wife happened to have been a Cheney grad.
Okay.
They were moving back to this area. I met him in June before I came here, 4 days before, and he said, "Oh, we're moving back to Cheney. Well, when I get there, I had just found out that I was coming here." He says, "Let me know if I can help you."
Right.
5 days after I got here, he called me. And 2 days later, he was here.
Right.
That wrote for me back when I was at Blue Cross. We needed a person who could, it was an expert writer, and she happened to have been associated with the university herself and had gone through the accreditation process, so knew the format, et cetera. So I actually picked people who could help, who had had pieces of what I needed in their other lives. And they were able we were able to form a team here at Cheney.
Right. So, after establishing your own team for which you thought and actually were successful in bringing Cheney back on track, what would you say was some of your biggest hurdles in getting Cheney back to where it needed to be?
The biggest hurdle, um, is culture.
Culture. Okay.
Culture is a very difficult thing to change. Cheney had been lulled into a sense of complacency for many, many reasons over a number of years. There had been a lack of oversight at the system level,
Mm-hmm.
oversight at the university level, et cetera. And a lot of processes and things had gone off kilter without correction. And
Mm-hmm.
I knew that in order to get us back to where we need to be to have a fighting chance with fighting out of line, with staffing not in alignment, with the skill sets necessary for some of the strategic roles that had to be here, with processes not almost non-existent, and
Right.
evidenced by some of the issues that Middle States had pointed out. So it wasn't without a list of issues that we faced that we had to deal with. And we basically began to assess the ability of individuals who were in place to actually execute the duties and responsibilities of roles that they were in.
Right.
That required significant organizational change and culture change. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, I've actually changed the management structure probably a couple times since I have been there in the 3.5 years. And there's no one in the same leadership role that was here when I came to Cheney.
Right.
We've put in processes. We've brought in people to support the students. We've done a lot of things to create that infrastructure that we were going to need for Cheney's short-term survival. And I said short-term because we had to get through that accreditation process in terms of getting off a show cause why you should continue to the affirmation of our accreditation, which actually just occurred in November of 2019.
Yes, and thank gosh for that.
Praise the Lord. Because without that, I wouldn't be sitting here talking with you today.
No, seriously. I remember when I was at Cheney, each year we were always worried that we were going to lose our accreditation. We're like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Like, are we going to have to go to another school? They were talking about Westchester taking us over. It was a lot. And it's very overwhelming. So I'm sure the students that are there now are very happy to have gotten their accreditation and it not being in jeopardy at this moment anyway. So that is a great accomplishment.
It was a good accomplishment, but you know, the statement I made right after we got the accreditation was this: now the work begins.
Exactly.
Because not having the affirmation of the accreditation was a distraction. We were so focused on dealing with the items that would lead us to get our accreditation reaffirmed that there were a lot of things that were still out of line that we needed to work on, and we continued. Right. So what it did was it allowed us to begin to focus on some long-term change that has to occur in order to position us to be the university of the 21st century. And that's all aspects of it. So you're right. I think it alleviated some of the stress of our students, our faculty, our staff in terms of that. But it gave us a new direction to go in terms of permanence and sustainability for the future. So the temporary reprieve from stress, but the stressors are still here.
Right. So being as though you had to get Cheney back on track, I'm sure there were some pretty tough decisions you had to make along the way. And I'm sure there were some that got a lot more pushback than others. Can you tell me about those experiences and how you pushed through and still stuck to what you believe was right to get us back on track?
Yes, I will. For years, Cheney had an open admissions process.
Okay.
In other words, Cheney had some minimal SAT and QPA requirements. It didn't necessarily abide by itself, except in the honors college. And we admitted a number of students.
It's okay.
I'll get rid of it. We admitted a number of students that really weren't academically prepared to be at Cheney.
Right.
That's okay if you have the ability to remediate them. It was a disproportionate number of students that were brought into Cheney that weren't academically prepared that probably would have benefited by going to community college for the first year or two to get experience before coming to Cheney. So when I arrived, one of the first decisions we made is that we had to use the standards that were established at Cheney to admit students. Admitting students that really weren't at the academic level that they needed to be has an effect on graduation, retention, and all. So we had some,
and that's how we're ranked. We're ranked on those things.
That's exactly right. So we had some pretty bad graduation retention rates and persistence rates because of the recruitment process. So we said, we're not going to do that. So I came up with a statement. I said, we're going to shrink to grow. And we had 700 and some students that had been recruited when I came here in 2017. Between 2017 and 18, we lost about 188 students.
Right.
55 because I eliminated the football team.
Yeah, I remember that.
That was very traumatic.
Right.
Because I love sports. I had played football myself, but the reality is sports and athletics at Cheney were so expensive, as they are everywhere, we couldn't afford them. Cheney was insolvent. When I came to Cheney, we were at least $60 million in debt.
Right. Yeah.
40 some million, or almost 40 million, that Cheney had been lent by the state system over a 5-year period to exist. And self-reported 29.5 million to the U.S. Department of Education for not executing student financial aid properly back in 2010, 11, 12, 13. So we had suggested to the department that we may have inappropriately administered financial aid to the tune of $29 million, which meant that stood out on our books as a liability.
Right.
As a liability, because we had to, at that point, submit a lot of paperwork to try to justify what had been done during those years. And that's taken us from then, even through today, we're still working through those issues, but we finally resolved the issue in 2020, in February. I just actually came to an agreement with the U.S. Department of Education. Instead of it being a potential $29 million liability that we had anticipated, it actually was a $57 million.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
we were able to negotiate with the department because of the progress that has been made over the last 3 years in terms of financial aid and getting that process back in place. They were very, very kind to us. And we settled on $14.3 million as the liability instead of the potential $57 million. And that was in addition to the $35 million that we owed back to the state. So we came into Cheney with no money in the bank.
Right.
Having, that level of a liability before us, which is why we said we had to put things back. We had to shrink to grow because we couldn't continue to bring students in that were not going to make it through Cheney. And we used up all their financial aid, et cetera, and then put them out. So I said,
exactly.
When we get to that point, we've got to downsize, which we did. And then we've got to invest in the future by bringing in students that are a little bit better prepared for the academic rigors. And the year after we did our shrink to grow, we increased by 31% in terms of the enrollment.
Oh, good.
Okay, so it was important. So those were some of the early, very difficult decisions. One, eliminating the football program was a very difficult decision. Shrinking the university in terms of size, in terms of the number of personnel that was here, faculty, et cetera, to meet the need. They were all challenged because anytime you disrupt a person's livelihood, you don't do it without much consideration.
Exactly.
But the reality was, if we didn't make these changes, Cheney was not going to exist.
Right.
And probably the biggest constituency that I had to be sensitive to were folks in your category, which are now the alumni.
Mm-hmm.
We have alumni that were my contemporaries back in the 70s that had graduated from Cheney that were at the top of their game. They were excellent.
Yeah, we have great alumni. We have a really good network.
Okay. Yeah. And then we had actually the last 10 or 12 years, we went downhill. So a lot of things that the alumni had experienced when they were here changed.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a lot of negative press the last 10 years about losing accreditation, misappropriation of funds, a lot of things that the university had to overcome. So we've suffered from negative publicity for years. So part of the transformation had to be changing the narrative about Cheney.
Mm-hmm.
Had to start with communicating with the alumni. So I actually started a quarterly national telephone call with the alumni, being parents, to bring them up to date on exactly what I was doing at Cheney.
Right.
A lot of recommendations on how I should run Cheney.
Of course.
I appreciated all those recommendations. And I took some to heart that I could, the others I had to discard. But the reality is, I was not new at this.
Mm-hmm.
What I had to do, I appreciated the input, but the reality is you can only have one leader at a time.
Exactly.
And unfortunately, Cheney has suffered for years for a lot of different people trying to lead Cheney. And, don't add too many cooks spoil the stew.
Mm-hmm.
You can only have one person in the kitchen. So I had to take on that role of leadership and directing the ship the way it has to be, because that was the accountability that was given to me. And I took it very, very seriously. So we've continued that dialogue. I think a lot of things have changed. Alumni have actually stepped up in many, many cases to help
Right.
our resurgence capital campaign that we did in 2018. If we hadn't done that campaign, Cheney wouldn't be. We had the
Right.
balanced budget. So actually in 2018, 19, and 19, 20 were the first 2 years we've had a balanced budget since 2011.
Right.
Balance.
And
Go
you,
ahead, go ahead.
and I think it was important to shrink to grow because not only like you said, it hurts our retention rate, but it just hurts our reputation. And I mean, like you said, we're such a small community, and being as though we have such negative press on our school, the best information that we can get has to come from the students that are already at Cheney. So it's
Absolutely.
like if they're leaving and they have nothing to offer and they have no more money, it looks really bad. It looks really bad. So if
That's
you're saying it worked, I think that was
that's the
great.
body that I got the most information from the
Right.
students, because I put in two filters when I first got here. What is in the best interest of the student and what helps the university? And you probably heard that when I came or when you were here.
Mm-hmm.
I said, those have to be the guiding posts for all decisions. If it isn't in the best interest of the students, we don't do it. If
Exactly.
it's help preserve the university, we don't do it. And they're not mutually exclusive. They have to have both of them. So all the decisions that have been made in the last 3.5 years have been made looking through those two lenses. It has probably made a lot of people unhappy, but allowed us to focus. And
Right.
everyone knew that these were the lenses through which we were going to look. So if we did things and you didn't like them, you had to ask the question, well, was that in the best interest of the student?
Mm-hmm.
Did it help preserve the university? That's what we're done. So
Right.
we're not gonna move away from that. But let me talk about another aspect of Cheney's evolution that I think is very, very important. Having come out of corporate, we lived on relationships.
Mm-hmm.
We saw very, very early in the process that with the financial position that Cheney was in terms of its appropriation, the students, the tuition, et cetera, the financials, we were never going to get where we need to be just on tuition and state appropriations.
Mm-hmm.
We had to monetize assets that existed at Cheney that could benefit the university long term. Two kinds of assets. They had land and they had buildings that were underutilized. Cheney sits on 275 acres in Chester County, one of the wealthiest counties in the state of Pennsylvania.
Mm-hmm.
We had a number of buildings that have been decommissioned for use because they were extinct in many respects.
Yeah. Outdated too.
They were outdated. We need to demolish them or repurpose them. So we actually began and we hired a company called Mosaic, which is an African-American property development firm out of Philadelphia, to reimagine how we could create public-private partnerships at Cheney that would do two things. It would, one, provide internships for our students that were currently at Cheney,
Mm-hmm.
expose them to professions and occupations that they would normally not be exposed to, and become tenants and pay us rent.
Right.
We have now 5 biotech companies that are resident in the Science Center, and we have 3 more companies that are coming on board, hopefully by the end of the first quarter. One, a solar panel manufacturing company, a 3D printing company, which will be the largest 3D printing operation on the Eastern Seaboard, and the other, a hemp processing company for medicinal purposes.
Mm-hmm.
These 3 companies will be coming on board and taking up residence in some of the decommissioned buildings in the first quarter of 2021.
Oh, good.
That starts that evolution of getting our students involved in industries that are coronavirus proof. They would be the industries of the 21st.
Seriously.
And I think that the announcement of that with the governor back in 2018, that we were going to do this institute, have these kinds of businesses, have been a large reason that a lot of students have decided to come to Cheney. They see opportunities at Cheney and some of these emerging partnerships that they would never get anywhere else. Plus, they are future employers of our students, because if they get an opportunity to intern and the companies get an opportunity to see them, they've got a much better chance of getting hired after graduation. And isn't the absolute end goal of this is to get a good quality education and then become gainfully employed so we can give back to society. And that's the ultimate.
You're right.
Those are what is in the best interest of the student and what helps preserve the university. So,
And it definitely seemed like it's a very holistic approach, because it kind of goes in a circle. The students, they get they get internships. The internships turn to jobs. They're successful, they can donate back so that more jobs can be created on campus and more students will graduate on time. So it kind of seems like it's a revolving circle, and it seems pretty like a good idea to me.
you figured it out, but I would expect no less from you. You're a Cheney grad.
Cheney grad.
And you know how we came up with that new, if you look at the website, you know what it says, Cheney made.
I say that all the time.
We engaged a PR firm to work with us on what would capture the essence of Cheney. And we said, and we all agreed as a management team and others that looked at it said, Cheney made is it, because when you graduate from Cheney, you can say you are Cheney made. When we begin to produce products and things that come out of Cheney, they will be branded Cheney made.
Yes.
You see,
it has to. I mean, till this day, when me and my friends like accomplish things, we have to give speeches or we get rewards or anything like that, we always say hashtag Cheney made under everything.
critical. It's critical.
It's like a thing.
We're creating a new narrative, and when we first came out with the vision statement, and that become the premier institution for excellence in academics, character, and social responsibility. We purposely put those things out as the vision of Cheney, because we feel that the model that we're creating for Cheney is the model of the 21st century.
Right.
Being the first HBCU, we have an obligation to lead.
Right.
I said anytime your role is to lead. So there are things that have occurred and are occurring at Cheney that will position Cheney for the next 183 years of its existence.
Right.
We stand on the shoulders of some giants who started Cheney and got us to this point. We have an obligation to take what was given to us to the next level, so that 183 years from today, two other folks, president and an aspiring law student, will be having a conversation 183 years from now about where change is going to go the next 183 years after that. Right. But the only way to assure a future is to create a future.
Right.
We're creating the dynamics and the future for the future Cheney. We don't want to rest on our laurels. The past was great, wonderful, but we don't drive our cars looking in the rearview mirror.
Exactly.
It happened to Cheney that were distasteful, and a lot of them were wonderful. That's great. What are you going to do now?
That's the question.
And we've got to move forward. And I think we've got the team in place. We've got support in place. Change is going to go nowhere but up from here. And then, as I said, Moses' job was to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. Joshua's job was to lead them into the promised land. Mine is to lead Cheney out of bondage. Whoever succeeds me will have to take Cheney forward, because we're limited, and we do the best that we can while we're there. So I'm going to do as much as I can in the time that I have here, and then turn it over to whoever comes after me.
Right. Okay, so I just have one final question. I'm gonna
Yes,
let you go
ma'am.
about your busy day because I'm sure you're very busy. But just in terms of the 2020 election that just passed, with the increased visibility towards HBCUs, do you think that this had any type of impact on the reputation of HBCUs and the desire of students to attend HBCUs? Just the overall impact of the past election.
I'm glad you asked that. I think it goes beyond the election.
Okay.
The I think the death of George Floyd,
Mm,
Breonna Taylor, Aubrey, all
mhm,
have an impact on society. As I said, culture is a
mhm,
major issue. Um, I think it's heightened or it's brought to light the level of racism that exists in this country. It
mhm,
already existed, but you need a catalyst for change. I've always said, unless there's a significant emotional experience, there's no change.
right.
This country is going through a significant emotional experience that's going to drive change. The trick is to make this change beneficial to all people. You know, when we talk about everyone being a part of this society and having their rightful place, I think
Mm,
that what it's done is it's spurred the diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda. It's resurfaced it. As I said, it started back in the 60s. It's
mhm,
back to light. And
right.
I do see, particularly with some of the initial uh, initial interest from corporate America, et cetera, some interest in change.
Right.
I'm one that's from Missouri. You got to show me.
Exactly.
It's got to be
Exactly.
sustained. It's got to be sustained. If this is not sustained, it will make us go backwards.
Right.
Can't afford that. So I am encouraged by what has happened, and it's happened in an environment of a pandemic, social unrest, all the negative things that can happen are happening. But I believe in making lemonade out of lemons.
Mhm.
We've got a lot of lemons right now that we have the opportunity to make lemonade out of. And
Right.
we have an obligation to each other and to this country to do some things that will make this a equitable and fair place for everyone. And it's
Mhm.
part of the HBC's role to do that because
Right.
we were established because we were disenfranchised
Right.
and to a large degree remain disenfranchised because
That's true.
we still not had a diverse, equal, and inclusive society. We still suffer from economic insufficiency in our communities. We have to get out of that economic insufficiency cycle. And it's going
Mhm.
to be aided by education. So HBCUs will become even more relevant in the future because they represent choice. If you don't
Mhm.
have choice, you have to go in one direction.
Exactly.
A choice for a number of people, including yourself, who may not have had an opportunity to go to school had there not been a Cheney.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So
Because
the
I'm on a Cheney scholarship in law school.
there you go.
It made a way for me. That's
So,
so true.
and what better way than a financial way? Because many of
Right.
us desire, but we can't afford to go to school. So I do see the potential of a very, very bright future. Uh, I say potential because potential has to be executed. So
Right.
I'm not going to say it's done because we're just at the beginning.
Exactly.
The work to be done is a lot of heavy lifting, but I'm encouraged.
Right. Stay strong. Well, thank you, Professor President Walton, for joining us today. And I hope I didn't take up too much of your time.
You know what? This is the highlight of my day and year to have
Right.
the opportunity to talk to one of our graduates that
Hmm.
moved on to the next level. And hopefully will never have to defend me, but will have to defend someone. And you will be able to say, I'm good because I was Cheney made.
This message has been brought to you by the National Black Leadership and Empowerment Project.